Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in history. Today we will delve into the dark mountains of Kentucky, where the Appalachian peaks hold secrets that time insists on concealing. If you are joining us, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. Let's uncover together what happened in those isolated lands. This video is a work of fiction, created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. It was 1916. The world was in turmoil, and even in the most remote regions of the United States, the echo of war reached them through belated newspapers and rumors brought by travelers. But in the mountains of Kentucky, especially in the more distant areas of Leslie County, life followed its own rhythm, oblivious to the great events. Communities lived scattered among deep valleys and steep slopes, where the morning mist lingered, and the silence was broken only by the sound of icy streams and the wind whistling through the pines. In that region, families had known each other for generations. Everyone knew who was who, where they lived, what lands they cultivated. Distrust of strangers was natural. The roads were precarious, often just muddy trails that snaked up the mountain. Getting there required determination, and few ventured there without a clear reason. It was a place where people minded their own business, where county law rarely appeared, and where secrets had room to grow in the shadows of the ancient trees. It was in this setting that Rosie Hale settled. Coming from a larger city to the south, she brought with her an aura of mystery that intrigued her neighbors. Living alone in a dark wooden cabin set back from the main road for almost 2 kilometers, Rosie kept her distance from the other families. She didn't participate in community meetings, nor did she attend the small church that served as a gathering place. When she needed provisions, she would go down to the nearest store, make her purchases in silence, and return before anyone could start a conversation. The locals speculated. Some said she had fled an unhappy marriage. Others murmured that she was hiding something darker, something that had forced her to seek refuge in the mountains. But no one knew for sure. Rosie offered no explanations, and her perpetually serious expression discouraged questions. Her dark eyes seemed to carry an invisible weight, and there was a sadness in them that discouraged approach. The cabin where she lived was simple but well kept. Smoke rose constantly from the chimney, even on the hottest days, as if she needed to keep something warm all the time. At night, a faint light flickered in the windows, and occasionally muffled sounds echoed through the valley. Neighbors passing by on the nearby trail reported hearing murmurs, as if Rosie were talking to someone. But she lived alone. At least that's what everyone believed. As the months passed, Rosie's presence became part of the landscape. People grew accustomed to her seclusion. After all, in the mountains, everyone was entitled to their own solitude. But then, something began to change. Small details that, in isolation, meant nothing, but together formed a disturbing pattern. The first signs appeared subtly, almost imperceptibly. The owner of the local store, a man named Thomas Brennan, began to notice something strange in Rosie's shopping patterns. She always bought the same basic items: flour, salt, canned goods, kerosene for the lamps. But starting in the autumn of that year, her purchases changed. She began to buy much larger quantities of food, always double or triple the usual amount. Thomas casually commented, asking if she was expecting visitors. Rosie simply shook her head negatively and left without saying a word. Even more intriguing was the fact that she began buying remedies, not the common ones for colds or everyday aches and pains, but specific tonics, substances to treat wounds, thick bandages. When the salesman suggested she see the traveling doctor who visited the area once a month, Rosie coldly replied that she took care of her own problems. There was something in the firmness of her voice that ended the conversation. Meanwhile, the sounds coming from the cabin became more frequent and disturbing. Martha Coleman, who lived on the nearest property about a mile away, began reporting to her neighbors that she heard strange things at night. They weren't just murmurs. They were sounds that resembled muffled moans, as if someone was suffering but unable to scream. Martha tried to convince her husband to investigate, but he refused. He said it wasn't their business what Rosie did on their own land. The seasons changed, and with them the mountain landscape. The winter of 1917 arrived brutally, bringing blizzards that further isolated the scattered communities. The trails became impassable for weeks. During this time, no one saw Rosie. Smoke continued to rise from her chimney, a sign that she was alive, but she did not go down to buy provisions even once during that entire harsh winter. When spring finally melted the snow and the paths became accessible again, Rosie reappeared at the store. But she was different. Her face, always thin, seemed even more hollow. Deep dark circles marked her eyes and her hands trembled slightly as she handled the coins to pay. Thomas Brennan asked if she had fared well during the winter. Rosie simply nodded and murmured something about having faced an illness but that she had recovered. However, the purchases became substantial again, and there was something new. She started buying large quantities of lime. This detail caught his attention because lime was generally used to treat soil or for specific sanitary purposes. Thomas was curious, but he didn't dare ask. There was an unspoken boundary that no one crossed with Rosie Hale. It was then that an incident brought the first crack to that wall of silence. A hunter named Samuel Pritchard was tracking a wounded deer along the slopes when he ended up getting closer than he intended to Rosie's property. He was following the animal's blood trail when he realized he was only a few hundred meters from the cabin. The sun was already beginning to set, tinging the sky orange and red, and Samuel decided it was time to turn back. But before turning around, something caught his attention. Behind the cabin, in an area partially hidden by dense trees, there was a small wooden shed he had never noticed before. The door was ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. Samuel wasn't one to snoop, but curiosity got the better of him. He approached cautiously, trying not to make a sound. What he saw through the crack in the door chilled him to the bone. Inside the shed were makeshift shelves, and on them glass bottles containing dark liquids. There were also tools hanging on the walls, some of them stained with something Samuel preferred not to identify, and on the floor, partially covered by a dirty cloth, something that looked like— He couldn't finish the thought. He quickly retreated, his heart pounding, and left the place as fast as he could without running. When he got home, Samuel told his wife what he had seen, but made her swear not to tell anyone. He wasn't sure what he had actually witnessed, and he didn't want to spread rumors that might be unfounded. But the seed of suspicion had been planted, and in time it would begin to germinate in unexpected ways. The following weeks brought more strangeness. Rosie began to be seen wandering the trails at twilight, always alone, carrying heavy bags. When she crossed paths with someone, she would look away and quicken her pace. Her posture was that of someone carrying an unbearable burden, not just physical but something deeper, darker. Neighbors began to exchange meaningful glances when her name was mentioned, but no one took any action. After all, she hadn't done anything illegal that they could prove. And in the mountains of Kentucky, privacy was sacred, even when it involved disturbing mysteries. Summer brought oppressive heat to the mountains. The air was thick, heavy with moisture, and even the wind that normally cooled the valleys seemed to have ceased. It was at this time that Martha Coleman decided she needed to act. The nightly sounds coming from Rosie's property had intensified, and Martha could no longer sleep peacefully. They weren't just muffled moans. Now they were rhythmic thumps, as if something heavy was being dragged across the wooden floor. Martha convinced 2 other women from the community to accompany her on an unannounced visit. They used a freshly baked apple pie as a pretext, a common neighborhood gesture in those parts. It was a flimsy excuse, but it would do. The 3 women climbed the trail one August morning, when the sun was not yet at its peak. The path was steep and required frequent pauses. When they finally spotted the cabin, they noticed that the front door was closed, but there was movement in the curtains of the windows. Martha knocked on the door. Silence. She knocked again, harder. They heard shuffling footsteps on the other side, slow and hesitant. When the door finally opened, Rosie appeared in the narrow crack. Her face was even paler, almost translucent, and there were dark marks under her eyes that suggested sleepless nights. She said nothing, only looked at the visitors with an expression that mixed surprise and something close to fear. Martha forced a smile and held out the pie. Rosie hesitated, but eventually accepted. The women expected to be invited inside, as was customary, but Rosie remained standing in the doorway, blocking their view of the interior. Martha tried to strike up a conversation, commenting on the weather, on the harvests, but Rosie only responded with monosyllables. There was a palpable tension in the air, a discomfort that grew with each passing second. It was then that one of the women, Elizabeth Murray, noticed something strange. Through the crack in the door, she managed to glimpse part of the cabin's interior. What she saw unsettled her. There were dark stains on the wooden floor, stains that looked like they had been repeatedly rubbed, but still left visible traces, and hanging on the walls were objects she couldn't quite identify, but which seemed out of place in an ordinary dwelling. Rosie noticed Elizabeth's inquisitive gaze and stepped back, closing the door almost completely. She thanked her for the pie in a trembling voice and said she was busy and needed to get back to her work. Before Martha could protest, the door slammed shut, and they heard the lock click into place on the other side. The three women stood there for a few moments, exchanging confused glances. What had just happened confirmed that something was deeply wrong. On the way back, Elizabeth couldn't contain her observations. She described the stains on the floor, the strange objects on the walls. Martha added that Rosie seemed terrified, as if she were hiding something terrible. The third woman, Sarah Bennett, suggested that perhaps they should notify the county sheriff, but Martha hesitated. The sheriff lived more than 30 kilometers away, and making a report without concrete evidence could cause problems. Besides, Rosie technically hadn't committed any crime that they could point to. It was all based on suspicions and feelings, but suspicions grew stronger when, days later, a smell began to spread through the area. It wasn't constant, only on the hottest afternoons when the wind blew in the right direction. It was a sweet, nauseating odor, reminiscent of something decomposing. Initially, the neighbors thought some animal had died nearby, something common in forests, but the smell persisted and seemed to come specifically from the direction of Rosie's property. Thomas Brennan, the store owner, had a private conversation with some men from the community. He mentioned Rosie's unusual purchases, especially the large quantities of lime. Lime was known for its odor-neutralizing properties and its ability to accelerate decomposition. It was used in cemeteries and in delicate sanitary situations. Why would a woman alone need so much lime? The question hung in the air unanswered. Samuel Pritchard, the hunter who had seen the shed months before, finally decided to share his experience. He described the jars, the stained tools, the covered object on the floor. His words were met with a heavy silence. The men exchanged glances, each processing the implications of what was being suggested. No one wanted to believe it, but the evidence was hard to ignore. It was decided that someone needed to investigate further. But who? And with what authority? The sheriff was too far removed to be involved without solid evidence, and no one wanted to confront Rosie directly, not after the way she had reacted to the women's visit. There was fear, too. Fear of what they might discover. Fear that their worst suspicions would be confirmed. While the community debated in silence, Rosie continued her solitary routine. But now, everyone was watching her. Her every move was noticed. Every visit to the store was commented on. She had become the center of an invisible web of surveillance, and she seemed to feel it. Her shoulders hunched more each day, as if the weight of the stairs were physical. And on moonless nights, when darkness completely swallowed the mountains, the sounds coming from her cabin echoed through the valley like disturbing reminders that something terrible was happening, something that no one yet dared to confront. Autumn 1917 arrived, bringing a change in the colors of the mountains. The trees were dressed in golden and crimson hues, and the temperature began to gradually drop. It was at this time that a stranger appeared in the region. His name was Daniel Whitmore, and he introduced himself as a representative of a lumber company interested in assessing the local forests for possible commercial exploitation. He stayed at the only available guest house, a modest house run by the widow Eleanor Price. Daniel was a middle-aged man, well-dressed by local standards, with polite but reserved manners. During his walks along the trails, taking notes in a black notebook, he inevitably overheard whispered conversations about Rosie Hale. Initially, he showed little interest, focused on his work. But as the days passed and more details reached his ears, his curiosity was piqued. One evening in the common room of the boarding house, Daniel sat by the fire next to Thomas Brennan. The conversation began casually, about the weather and the prospects for the harvest. But Thomas, perhaps influenced by the drink that warmed his hands, began to talk about Rosie. He spoke of the strange purchases, the extreme isolation, the rumors that circulated. Daniel listened attentively, asking pointed questions that demonstrated genuine interest. What Thomas didn't know was that Daniel Whitmore wasn't exactly who he claimed to be. Although he did work appraising land, he had a past as a private investigator in Louisville. He had left that profession after a case that ended badly, but his instincts never completely abandoned him, and something about the stories surrounding Rosie Hale rekindled that old investigative flame within him. In the following days, Daniel began asking more targeted questions. He spoke with Martha Coleman, who described the unsettling visit to the cabin. He talked to Samuel Pritchard, who reluctantly shared what he had seen in the shed. Each conversation added a piece to the puzzle Daniel was mentally assembling, and the more pieces that fell into place, the darker the picture became. Daniel decided he needed to see for himself. One cloudy afternoon, he grabbed his backpack and set off on a hike that, he told Mrs. Price, would take him to the northern edge of the region to assess a specific wooded area. But his true destination was Rosie Hale's property. He planned his route to pass close to the cabin, staying in the wooded areas where he could observe without being seen. He arrived in the vicinity in the late afternoon when the shadows were beginning to lengthen between the trees. He positioned himself behind a dense cluster of pine trees that offered a partial view of the cabin and shed Samuel had mentioned. And then he waited. The silence of the forest was broken only by the distant song of a few nocturnal birds and the occasional rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. Night fell quickly, as always happened in the mountains. A faint light appeared in the cabin window, probably from an oil lamp. Daniel remained in his position, motionless, his eyes fixed on the building. Hours passed without anything remarkable happening. He was beginning to wonder if he had wasted his time when around midnight the cabin door opened. Rosie emerged, carrying something heavy wrapped in a dark cloth. She moved with difficulty, stopping frequently to adjust the weight in her arms. Daniel felt his heart race. She walked towards the shed, disappearing inside. The light from the lamp she carried cast distorted shadows through the cracks in the wooden planks. Daniel could hear muffled sounds, movements, something being dragged. He watched for over an hour. When Rosie finally emerged from the shed, she was carrying nothing. Her hands appeared to be stained, and she compulsively rubbed them on her skirt as she walked back into the cabin. The door closed. The light from the window went out, and silence returned to the night. Daniel knew he had witnessed something significant, but he wasn't sure exactly what. His suspicions grew, but suspicions weren't proof. He needed more. He decided that the next morning, as soon as Rosie left the property to go shopping at the sale, he would examine the shed more closely. It was risky, potentially illegal, but his conscience wouldn't allow him to ignore what might be happening there. He spent the rest of the night in restless sleep at the inn, mentally rehearsing what he would do. At dawn, he positioned himself nearby again, this time with a clear plan. He watched Rosie leave the cabin around 8 in the morning, following the trail toward the store. He knew he had at least 2 hours before her return. It was enough time if he was careful. He approached the shed, his heart racing. The door was locked with a simple bolt. He took a deep breath, looked around to make sure he was alone, and opened it. What you found inside would change everything. It would change not only your understanding of the case, but also the fate of that entire small community in the Kentucky mountains. The shed held secrets that no one was prepared to face, secrets that would challenge even the most experienced investigators. Daniel stood still at the entrance of the warehouse for long seconds, his eyes adjusting to the dim light inside. The smell that hit him was intense, a mixture of chemicals, damp earth, and something organic that he couldn't quite identify. The shelves Samuel had mentioned were there, filled with bottles of various sizes. Some contained clear liquids, others dark and viscous. There were handwritten labels on some of them, but the handwriting was difficult to decipher in the little light available. In the opposite corner, tools hung on the wall, forming a disturbing collection. There were saws of different sizes, long knives, instruments that seemed to have medical or surgical purposes. Daniel wasn't an expert in these areas, but he recognized some items that shouldn't be in the possession of an ordinary person. Next to the tools, a pile of stained fabrics was folded irregularly, as if they had been used and reused multiple times. What caught his attention most, however, was in the center of the shed. A sturdy wooden table, darkened by time and use, occupied a good part of the space. Its surface was marked by numerous scratches and deep carvings. There were stains that seemed permanent, absorbed by the wood itself. Underneath the table, metal buckets and more fabrics were piled up. Daniel approached cautiously, trying to understand the purpose of that arrangement. That's when he noticed something in the corners of the shed. There were marks on the dirt floor, as if something heavy had been repeatedly dragged from the center towards the back of the building. He followed the marks with his eyes and realized they led to an area covered by loose planks. His investigative instinct screamed that he should lift those planks, but a part of him hesitated. There was a line between curiosity and trespassing that he knew he was about to cross. He checked his pocket watch. He still had time. With trembling hands, he began to carefully remove the boards, trying not to make a sound. The wood was damp and heavy. When he finally removed the main pieces, an opening in the floor was revealed. a kind of makeshift cellar dug into the earth. The darkness down there was absolute. Daniel lit a match, its weak light flickering. What the flame illuminated made him instinctively recoil. There were structures descending into that subterranean space, like a small, rough wooden staircase. And down there, partially visible in the flickering light, he saw shapes wrapped in fabric, arranged in an organized manner. He couldn't make out the details, but the implication was too clear to ignore. The match burned his fingers and he dropped it, returning to the darkness. Daniel needed a few moments to regain his composure. His darkest suspicions were being confirmed, but he needed more concrete evidence before making any decisions. He carefully put the boards back in place, trying to leave everything exactly as he found it. He looked around the shed once more, memorizing every detail. Then, silently, he went out and closed the door, making sure the bolt was in its original position. He quickly moved away from the property, his heart still racing. He needed to think, he needed to decide what to do with what he had discovered. Going back to the boarding house and acting as if nothing had happened would be impossible. But confronting Rosie alone would be reckless and potentially dangerous. The most sensible option would be to seek out the sheriff, but that would take time, and he wasn't sure the authorities would take his suspicions seriously without more substantial evidence. He spent the rest of the day wandering the trails, trying to organize his thoughts. When he returned to the inn at nightfall, Eleanor Price remarked that he seemed troubled. Daniel brushed it off, saying he had gotten lost on the trails and stayed longer than planned in the strong sun. She offered him tea and a hot meal, but he barely managed to touch the food. That night, lying in his narrow bed, Daniel made a decision. He would go to town to find the sheriff himself. He would present everything he had discovered, the accounts from the residents, his own observations. Even if it took days to convince the authorities, it was the right course of action. He couldn't simply leave and abandon the situation. His conscience wouldn't allow it. However, fate had other plans. The following morning, before Daniel could leave, a commotion swept through the small community. Martha Coleman had arrived at the store in a state of great agitation, hurriedly talking about something that had happened during the night. Rosie Hale had come down from her cabin before dawn, banging on Martha's door in evident desperation. For the first time since arriving in those mountains, Rosie had asked for help. Daniel joined the residents who had gathered at the store to hear Martha's account. According to her, Rosie was in a deplorable state, with dirty and torn clothes, disheveled hair, and eyes red from crying. She said she couldn't bear the weight any longer, that she needed to confess, that she had committed acts for which she would never be forgiven. Martha, frightened but compassionate, had tried to calm Rosie, but the woman was almost incoherent, alternating between sobs and incomprehensible murmurs. Thomas Brennan suggested that someone go to the cabin to check if everything was all right. Daniel immediately volunteered, accompanied by Samuel Pritchard and 2 other men from the community. They climbed the trail in a tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they might find. The morning sun illuminated the mountains with a golden light that contrasted brutally with the darkness of what they were about to discover. The walk to the cabin seemed to last an eternity, although it took no more than 20 minutes. The group walked in single file, Daniel in the lead, because he knew the path better from his observations of the previous days. Samuel followed closely behind, carrying his rifle, not because he intended to use it, but because in the mountains it was customary to be prepared for any eventuality. The other 2 men, Jacob Foster and William Hayes, walked in silence, exchanging nervous glances when the cabin finally appeared among the trees. The place looked different in the daylight. There was an unsettling stillness in the air, as if even the birds avoided the area. The front door was ajar, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Daniel motioned for the others to stop and approached alone, calling Rosie's name. No answer. He pushed the door open slowly, the creaking of the hinges echoing ominously. The interior of the cabin turned out to be surprisingly tidy. Simple but well-maintained furniture, a small kitchen with clean utensils hanging on the wall, a bed neatly made in a corner. But there were also disturbing elements. The stains on the floor that Elizabeth had mentioned were more extensive than they initially appeared through the crack in the door. They had been vigorously scrubbed, but the wood had absorbed some of the material, leaving dark, permanent shadows. On the walls hanging from hooks were hand-drawn diagrams. Daniel approached to examine them more closely. They were anatomical diagrams, surprisingly detailed and precise. They showed internal structures, organ systems, proportions, and measurements noted in the margins. The handwriting was the same as that on the labels on the jars in the shed, delicate but firm. There were also pages torn from medical books, fixed to the wall with nails, some so old that the paper was yellowed and brittle. Samuel entered the cabin behind Daniel, followed by the others. They all watched in silence, trying to process what they saw. Jacob found a wooden box under the bed and dragged it outside. Inside were notebooks, dozens of them, all filled with meticulous notes. Daniel picked one at random and began to leaf through it. The pages contained dated records, clinical observations, descriptions of procedures. The language was technical, almost scientific, but the context suggested something deeply disturbing. One entry caught his eye. Dated March of that year, it described in detail a preservation process using specific chemical substances. It mentioned ideal temperatures, exposure times, and expected results. Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine. This was no ordinary person's work. There was knowledge involved, training, a methodology that suggested prior experience. William, who had remained near the door, called the others. He had found something behind a curtain that separated a small room from the rest of the cabin. It was a kind of makeshift office, with a table covered in papers, stacked books, and more bottles containing various liquids. But what really caught his attention was a framed photograph on the table. It showed Rosie, many years younger, dressed in formal clothes, next to a grey-haired man wearing a white lab coat. Behind them, a sign hung on the wall which, although out of focus in the photo, seemed to indicate some kind of medical institution. Daniel examined the photo more closely. There was an inscription at the bottom, written in faded ink. He could only partially decipher the words, but he made out what appeared to be a name and a year, 1898. This meant the photo was almost 20 years old. Rosie appeared to be around 20 in the picture, which would put her in her 40s now. But who was the man beside her? And what kind of institution was it? The men decided it was time to check the shed. If their suspicions were correct, that's where they would find the most conclusive evidence. They left the cabin and walked the 50 meters that separated them from the smaller building. Daniel felt his stomach churn when Samuel opened the bolt. This time, with daylight streaming through the cracks in the boards, the interior was more visible than on their previous visit. Everything was exactly as he remembered it. The shelves with jars, the hanging tools, the marked table. But now, with 4 pairs of eyes examining every detail, new elements were revealed. There was a rudimentary ventilation system in the ceiling, metal pipes leading outside, probably to disperse odors. The walls had been covered with lime in some areas, clearly in an attempt to control the proliferation of fungi and bacteria. Jacob approached the shelves and began reading the labels on the bottles. Some contained names of substances he vaguely recognized from conversations with the traveling doctor. Formaldehyde, ethyl alcohol, saline solutions. Others were completely unknown to him. There were also containers with what appeared to be preserved specimens, but the contents were difficult to identify through the cloudy glass and murky liquid. Daniel knew the time had come to reveal what he had discovered on the ground. He pointed to the loose planks and briefly explained that there was an underground space beneath. The other 3 men exchanged glances, the tension palpable. No one wanted to be the first to look, but they all knew it was necessary. Samuel, being the oldest and most experienced of the group, took on the responsibility. They removed the boards again, this time more easily, since Daniel had already loosened them the day before. The opening turned out to be larger than it had initially seemed. The rough ladder descended about 2 meters to the bottom. Samuel picked up a lamp he had found hanging on the wall and climbed down carefully, his companions watching from above with bated breath. The lamplight gradually illuminated the underground space. It was larger than they had expected, carefully excavated to create a kind of chamber approximately 3 square meters. The earthen walls had been reinforced with planks to prevent collapses. The low ceiling forced Samuel to stoop, but what truly mattered was laid out along the walls. There were wooden structures, similar to shelves or bunk beds, built at different levels, and on top of these structures, shapes wrapped in fabric and tied with ropes. Samuel counted them silently. 6 in total, different sizes, different shapes. Some seemed to have been there longer, others were clearly more recent. The smell of chemicals was strong even with the ventilation, but there was also an underlying odor of decomposition that the condoms couldn't completely mask. Samuel didn't touch anything. He just observed, memorized, and then climbed back up, his face pale and expression grave. When he emerged from the hole, the others bombarded him with questions, but he just shook his head. He said they needed to bring the authorities in immediately, that this was far beyond what they could or should handle alone. There was evidence of activities that only trained investigators and law enforcement officials should examine. Daniel fully agreed. He suggested that 2 of them remain guarding the property to ensure nothing was altered, while the other 2 would go to town to fetch the sheriff. The sun was already high, and if they left immediately, they could be back the next day with the authorities. Samuel and William volunteered to make the trip, being the best horsemen in the group and knowing the shortcuts through the mountains. As the 2 prepared to leave, Daniel and Jacob were tasked with setting up a discreet camp nearby, from where they could keep watch unseen should Rosie decide to return. But one question hung over everyone. Where was Rosie now? Martha had said she had left after her fragmented confession, disappearing down the trail before anyone could stop her. Was she running away? Or did she have other plans? The afternoon wore on slowly. Daniel and Jacob took turns keeping watch, one always awake while the other rested. The cabin and the shed remained silent and empty. No movement, no sign of life. It was as if the place had been abandoned years ago, when in fact Rosie had been there just the night before, carrying out her shadowy activities under the cover of darkness. As the sun began to set, tinging the sky with shades of orange and purple, Daniel reflected on everything they had discovered. The evidence pointed to something systematic, planned, executed with technical expertise. Rosie wasn't an impulsive or reckless killer. She was someone who knew exactly what she was doing, someone who had transformed that isolated cabin in the mountains into a place dedicated to purposes that defied comprehension. And the questions multiplied. Who were those people preserved in the basement? Where did they come from? How had Rosie lured them to that remote place? And most importantly, why? What was the ultimate goal of all this? Night fell over the Kentucky mountains, bringing with it the characteristic chill of autumn and a starry sky that contrasted sharply with the darkness of the day's discoveries. Daniel and Jacob remained alert, knowing that the next few hours would be crucial. Somewhere in those endless mountains, Rosie Hale lay free, carrying with her the secrets that could explain the horrors they had left behind. The night in the mountains was unlike any other Daniel had ever experienced. The silence wasn't truly silence, but a symphony of subtle sounds amplified in the darkness. The rustling of dry leaves, the distant howl of coyotes, the occasional crackling of dry branches. Each sound made his heart race, wondering if it was Rosie returning to their property. But the hours passed and nothing happened. The cabin remained dark and silent, a denser shadow against the night backdrop. Jacob dozed leaning against a tree while Daniel kept watch. His thoughts constantly returned to the photograph they had found in the cabin. That man in the lab coat, the medical institution in the background, Rosie young and seemingly respectable. There was a story there, a past that would surely explain at least part of what she had become. Daniel wished he could have brought the photo with him, but they agreed not to remove anything from the scene, leaving everything intact for the official investigation. As the first lights of dawn began to brighten the horizon, bringing bluish hues to the still dark sky, Daniel woke Jacob. They needed to decide what to do during the day ahead. Staying there indefinitely wasn't sustainable. They had brought only water and a few biscuits, enough for a day, maybe 2 if they rationed, but Samuel and William wouldn't return with the sheriff before nightfall at best. It was Jacob who suggested they go down to the store to get food and update the other residents on the situation. They could return afterward, thus ensuring the community knew what was happening. Daniel hesitated initially, worried about leaving the property unguarded, but recognized the wisdom of the proposal. Besides, they wanted to check if there was any news about Rosie, if anyone had seen her. They descended the trail as the sun rose fully, illuminating the valleys and slopes with that characteristic golden light of autumn mornings. The temperature was still low, and their breaths formed small clouds of vapor. They arrived at the store around 7 in the morning, finding Thomas Brennan already opening the establishment. His face showed surprise at seeing them, but the expression quickly changed to concern when he noticed the gravity etched on their faces. Inside the shop, with hot coffee warming their hands, Daniel and Jacob recounted everything they had found. Thomas listened in silence, his face gradually paler as the details were revealed. When they finished, he remained silent for long moments, processing the information. Finally, he murmured that he had always known there was something deeply wrong with Rosie, but he had never imagined the extent of it. Martha Coleman arrived shortly afterward, followed by Elizabeth Murray and other women from the community. The news was already beginning to spread, and everyone wanted to know more. Daniel repeated the account, this time omitting some of the more disturbing details to spare the sensibilities present. But the essence was clear. Rosie Hale had transformed her isolated property into a place dedicated to practices that no one could fully understand, but which certainly involved terrible activities. Martha mentioned that Rosie hadn't returned home since leaving the previous morning. No one had seen her on any of the main trails. It was as if she had simply vanished into the vast expanses of the mountains. Some suggested she might have headed towards the valley on the other side of the mountain range, where there was a road that eventually led to larger towns. Others thought she might have hidden in one of the many natural caves that dotted the region. Daniel realized something important at that moment. If Rosie had truly run away, she had only taken the clothes on her back. She had left behind all her belongings, all her meticulously filled notebooks, all the evidence of her activities. This made no sense for someone planning a definitive escape. A person with her level of organization and method would have prepared an escape route, destroyed evidence, taken important documents. Unless her desperate confession to Martha wasn't part of a plan, but a genuine emotional breakdown. Thomas brought up a possibility that no one wanted to consider. What if Rosie hadn't run away, but instead sought out a secluded place to end her own story? The mountains offered countless precipices, deep rivers, places where a person could disappear without a trace. Martha protested, saying that despite everything, Rosie deserved the opportunity to explain her actions, to face justice properly. But the shadow of that possibility hung over the conversation. The morning progressed with more residents arriving at the store, transforming the place into a sort of makeshift command center. Someone suggested organizing search parties to look for Rosie, but Daniel argued against it. He said it was dangerous to have civilians scouring the mountains for someone who might be desperate and unpredictable. It was better to wait for the authorities, who would arrive equipped and trained to handle the situation. Then came some unexpected information. A man named Herbert Lewis, who lived on a distant property to the southeast, appeared saying he had seen something strange the previous night. Around midnight, he was awake, tending to a sick cow, when he heard the sound of someone walking hurriedly along the path that passed near his land. He lit a lamp and went out to investigate, arriving in time to see a female figure disappearing into the darkness, moving urgently towards the more remote areas of the mountain. Herbert hadn't been able to see her face, but her stature and gait matched what he knew of Rosie. She was heading in a direction that led nowhere to any known property, only to wild areas where few ventured. There were some abandoned structures in that area, old hunters' cabins, an old sawmill that had been inactive for decades. Perhaps Rosie knew some of these places and was hiding there. Daniel and Jacob decided it was time to return to the observation post near Rosie's property. If the sheriff arrived that afternoon, as they expected, they needed to be there to guide him and provide all the information they had gathered. But before they left, Daniel asked Thomas to show him everything he could remember about Rosie's purchases over the past few years. Thomas had a habit of keeping basic records, and although they weren't detailed, they might offer clues about the timeline of her activities. The records revealed an interesting pattern. Rosie's purchases had changed drastically about 18 months earlier, at the beginning of 1916. Before that, she bought only basic provisions, normal quantities for a person living alone. But from that date onward, the volumes increased significantly, and unusual items began to appear on the lists. Chemicals, large quantities of fabric, specialized tools. Something had changed during that period, something that had led her to begin or intensify her shady activities. Daniel mentally registered this information. 18 months. This meant that there was potentially evidence dating from that period to the present. If the shapes in the basement represented what he suspected, then during that time, multiple people had disappeared or been drawn to Rosie's property. But who were these people? Travelers? Wanderers? The region saw few strangers, and surely disappearances would be noticed and discussed. This reflection brought up another disturbing question. What if the people in question weren't from the region? What if Rosie had some method of attracting outsiders, people whose absence wouldn't be immediately noticed or investigated? The roads that cut through the mountains saw occasional traffic of traveling salesmen, seasonal workers, fugitives seeking refuge, people without strong ties, without families looking for them, people who could disappear without leaving big ripples. When Daniel and Jacob finally returned to their observation post, the sun was already high in the sky. The property remained deserted and silent. They settled down again among the trees, this time with additional provisions that Thomas had insisted on providing. The wait began anew, but now with a renewed sense of purpose. In a few hours, the authorities would arrive, and the official investigation would begin. Daniel used the time to mentally review everything they knew. The old photo suggesting Rosie's medical or scientific connection. The detailed notebooks with technical language. The shed equipped as a kind of laboratory or procedure room. The basement containing preserved evidence. And the desperate escape after a fragmented confession. Each piece individually was disturbing, but together they formed a picture that suggested something beyond simple criminality. There was purpose there, methodology, perhaps even a distorted justification that made sense only in Rosie's mind. The afternoon brought changes in the weather. Dark clouds began to gather over the mountain peaks, and the wind picked up. A storm was approaching, common at that time of year, but always impressive at high altitudes. Daniel worried about Samuel and William, hoping they could return before the rains made the trails impassable. It was then, as the sun began to be obscured by clouds and the first drops of rain began to fall, that Daniel heard sounds coming from the direction of the main path. It wasn't the galloping of horses he expected, but human footsteps, slow and dragging. He signaled for Jacob to remain silent, and they both positioned themselves to see who was approaching. The figure that emerged from the bend in the trail made Daniel's heart stop for a moment. It was Rosie Hale. She had returned. Her clothes were dirty and torn, covered in mud and leaves. Her hair, normally tied in a tight bun, fell disheveled over her shoulders. But what was most striking was her expression. There was no fear or despair. There was only a profound resignation, as if she had made a final decision and was at peace with the consequences. Rosie walked straight to the cabin, not looking to either side, seemingly oblivious to the rain that was beginning to fall more heavily. She went inside and closed the door behind her. Moments later, light appeared in the windows. She was inside, waiting. But waiting for what? For the sheriff who would come to arrest her? For some resolution that only she understood? Daniel and Jacob exchanged glances, undecided about what to do. Should they confront her? Should they simply continue waiting? The decision was made when, less than an hour later, they finally heard the sound of horses. Samuel and William were returning, and they were not alone. 3 men accompanied them, mounted on sturdy horses and wearing raincoats. The sheriff of Leslie County had arrived, bringing with him 2 deputies. The real investigation was about to begin, and with it, perhaps, the answers to the dark mysteries that had haunted those mountains for so long. Sheriff Harold Mason was a man of average height, around 50 years old, with a thick mustache and a penetrating gaze that conveyed decades of experience dealing with the most varied situations the Kentucky mountains could present. His deputies, both younger, carried rifles and seemed prepared for any eventuality. They dismounted near the point where Daniel and Jacob were waiting for them, and Samuel made the introductions quickly while the rain intensified. Daniel reported everything to the sheriff, from the community's initial suspicions to the discoveries in the cabin and the shed. Mason listened without interrupting, his face remaining expressionless, but his eyes revealing the seriousness with which he absorbed every detail. When Daniel mentioned that Rosie had returned and was now inside the cabin, the sheriff nodded slowly and began to give instructions to his men. The approach would be cautious but firm. Mason made it clear that he didn't want unnecessary violence, but he also wouldn't take any risks. One of the deputies positioned himself on the side of the cabin, with a view of the back door in case Rosie tried to escape that way. The other remained near the main entrance, rifle in hand but pointed downwards. The sheriff then walked to the door and knocked 3 times, loudly and deliberately. There was a silence that seemed to stretch on endlessly. The rain drumming on the cabin roof and the leaves of the trees created a continuous sound that made it difficult to hear any internal movement. Mason knocked again, this time announcing his presence and authority. His voice was strong, accustomed to being obeyed, but there was also a note of professional respect, like someone who understood the gravity of the situation. The door opened slowly. Rosie appeared in the doorway, illuminated by the dim light of the lamp behind her. Her face was calm, almost serene, an expression that contrasted dramatically with the state of her clothes and hair. She looked at the sheriff, then at the men positioned around her, and finally spoke. Her voice was low but clear, without a trace of hysteria or fear. She said she knew why they were there, that she had been waiting for them, and that she was ready to accompany them. Mason asked permission to enter the cabin and examine the premises. Rosie simply stepped away from the door in a gesture of acquiescence. The sheriff entered cautiously, followed by Daniel, whom he had invited to accompany him as a civilian witness. The deputies remained outside with Rosie, maintaining a respectful but vigilant distance. Inside the cabin, Mason systematically examined every corner. He observed the stains on the floor, the diagrams on the walls, the stacked notebooks. He leafed through some of them, his expression growing progressively darker as he read the meticulous notes. He asked Daniel to show him the shed, and together they walked in the torrential rain. The interior of the shed provoked a visible reaction even in the experienced sheriff. He stood there for long moments just observing, his jaw clenched. He examined the jars, the tools, the marked table. When Daniel pointed to the loose boards on the floor, Mason nodded gravely and descended into the underground space with a lamp. He stayed down there for almost 10 minutes, long enough to carefully examine the evidence without disturbing it. When he emerged, his face was pale despite the experience he carried. He told Daniel that he would need to bring in more men, that this was bigger than his small team could adequately handle. He mentioned that he would send a message to the state capital, requesting specialized investigators. This was no ordinary rural crime case. There were complexities that demanded expertise beyond what he could offer. They returned to the cabin where Rosie waited, seated in a chair, flanked by her helpers. The rain had lessened to a persistent drizzle. Mason sat at the table opposite her, took a notebook from his inside coat pocket, and prepared to ask questions. But before he could begin, Rosie raised her hand in a gesture asking for silence. She said she wanted to tell her story, that she needed to tell it, but that she wanted to do it her way without interruptions. Mason hesitated, then agreed. Sometimes allowing a suspect to speak freely revealed more than structured interrogations. Rosie took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on a distant point, as if she were looking not at the present, but at some place lost in the past. And then she began to speak, her voice gaining an almost hypnotic quality in the quiet of that mountain cabin. She recounted that she was born in Baltimore, Maryland, the daughter of a respected doctor who worked at a university hospital. From a young age, she had shown an interest in medicine, but at a time when women were rarely accepted into medical schools. Her father, progressive for the standards of the time, arranged for her to work as an assistant in his laboratory. There, Rosie developed a particular fascination with anatomy and tissue preservation. When she was 22 in 1898, her father got her a position at a private institution that conducted medical research. Rosie worked there for almost 10 years, learning advanced preservation techniques, studying anatomical structures, and contributing to research that would eventually save lives. It was work she loved, work that gave meaning to her existence. But then something happened, something she didn't fully detail, involving research that crossed ethical boundaries. The institution was abruptly closed by the authorities in 1908. Some of the researchers were arrested, others simply disappeared. Rosie, though not directly implicated, saw her reputation destroyed by association. No hospital or university would accept her. Her father, ashamed, cut off all contact. She was left alone, with knowledge and skills she could no longer legitimately use. For years she wandered from town to town, supporting herself with odd jobs, always hiding her past. But the need to apply her knowledge, to continue the work she considered her calling, never left her. Eventually, in 1915, she arrived in the mountains of Kentucky seeking isolation, where she could rebuild something resembling her old laboratory, a place where she could continue her studies away from judgmental eyes. Rosie's voice trembled slightly as she reached the next part. She explained that initially she had planned only to study animal specimens, to continue perfecting preservation techniques. But loneliness, bitterness over lost years, and perhaps something darker that she herself couldn't fully name, led her down a different path. She began to think about the possibilities she had never been able to legitimately explore, the studies that social and ethical conventions forbade. When occasional travelers passed through the region, people without a fixed destination, with no one to ask about them, Rosie began to see them not as individuals but as opportunities to continue the work she had been forced to abandon, to prove to herself that her knowledge had value, even if that value existed only in her own mind, distorted by bitterness and isolation. Sheriff Mason interrupted at that point, his voice tense as he asked how many people were involved. Rosie closed her eyes for a long moment before answering. 6 over 18 months. each one meticulously documented in her notebooks, each procedure recorded with the clinical precision she had learned decades before. These were not acts of impulsive violence, she insisted, but the continuation of scientific research, though she recognized that the world would never see it that way. Daniel felt nauseous listening to the coldness with which Rosie described her actions. There was a fundamental disconnect between the humanity of the victims and how she viewed them merely as objects of study. The sheriff, maintaining admirable professionalism, inquired about the identities of these people. Rosie said she didn't know their real names in most cases. They were drifters, temporary workers, people she persuaded to accept hospitality in her remote cabin during storms or cold nights. People who trusted in the apparent kindness of a lonely woman. The confession continued for over an hour, with Rosie detailing technical aspects, but never the specific moments of the deaths. Even in her distorted narrative, there seemed to be a line she wouldn't cross verbally. Mason constantly took notes, his face a mask of professional control. When Rosie finally finished, the silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by the rain that had started again outside. The sheriff finally spoke, his voice heavy with the responsibility that had fallen on his shoulders. He told Rosie that she was under arrest on suspicion of multiple murders, that she would be transported to the county jail, and that she would face a formal trial when the investigations were complete. Rosie simply nodded, as if she had expected exactly those words, as if her confession were an inevitable part of an outcome she had always known would come. The following days transformed that tranquil region of the Kentucky mountains into a center of unprecedented activity. Sheriff Mason kept his word and sent messages to the capital requesting specialized support. Within a week, state investigators arrived accompanied by a medical examiner and official documenters. Rosie's property was cordoned off with ropes and warning signs, while teams meticulously catalogued every item, every note, every piece of evidence. Daniel remained in the region during this period, serving as a witness and assistant when needed. He observed the investigators working with impressive efficiency, photographing everything, numbering each vial, each tool, each page of the notebooks. The process was slow and methodical, exactly as it needed to be. There could be no mistakes, not in a case of this magnitude. The community reacted in diverse ways to the full revelation of what had happened within their midst. Some residents felt guilty for not having acted sooner, for having ignored the signs that now seemed so obvious in retrospect. Martha Coleman especially carried this burden, constantly repeating that she should have insisted more, should have involved the authorities sooner. But others remembered that in the mountains, respecting the privacy of others was a deeply ingrained tradition, and that no one could have foreseen the extent of Rosie's activities. Thomas Brennan found himself in a delicate position. As a supplier of many of the materials Rosie had used, he felt partially responsible, although legally he had done nothing wrong. He spent sleepless nights mentally reviewing each transaction, each conversation, looking for signs he should have noticed. Investigators interviewed him extensively about the purchase records, using this information to construct a chronology of activities. Rosie was kept in the county jail, in solitary confinement under constant surveillance. Sheriff Mason feared she might attempt suicide, as occasionally happened with prisoners facing serious charges. But Rosie appeared strangely calm, almost relieved. She cooperated fully with investigators, answering technical questions about her notebooks, explaining procedures when asked. Her clinical coolness remained intact, as if she were discussing legitimate scientific experiments rather than horrific acts. Investigators worked to identify the victims, a task complicated by the transient nature of those people. Through belongings found preserved alongside the remains in the basement, they were able to establish some identities. There was a traveling hardware salesman who had disappeared in April 1916, whose family in Tennessee spent more than a year searching unsuccessfully. A traveling sawmill worker whom no one had reported missing because he had no known family. A woman who was apparently traveling, fleeing a difficult domestic situation, with no ties binding her to a specific place. Each identification carried with it tragic stories of lives cut short, of unrealized potential. Daniel participated in some of these investigations, using his old skills as a private investigator to help connect the dots. It was emotionally draining work, but necessary. These people deserved to have their names restored. They deserved to be remembered as individuals, and not just as anonymous victims. The case attracted the attention of newspapers beyond the region. Reporters began to arrive from larger cities, eager for sensational details. Sheriff Mason, demonstrating wisdom, tightly controlled the flow of information, providing only the essentials and protecting the dignity of the victims as much as possible. He did not allow photographs of the property, nor did he divulge specific details from Rosie's notebooks. The story was disturbing enough without unnecessary embellishment. Meanwhile, the small community tried to process and move on. Meetings were held at the local church where people shared feelings, fears, and tried to make sense of what had happened. The pastor, an elderly man named Reverend Clark, offered words of comfort but also reflection. He spoke about how evil can exist in unexpected places, about the importance of community vigilance, balanced with compassion, about forgiveness, even when it seems impossible. Daniel found himself at a personal crossroads. His land appraisal work was complete, and technically there was no reason to stay, but he felt connected to that place and those people in a way he hadn't experienced in years. There was something about that community, about the way they faced adversity together, that touched something deep within him. Eleanor Price, the landlady, remarked one evening that he seemed to have found purpose again, something that had clearly been lacking when he arrived. The trial date was set for December 1917. It would be held at the county seat, in the courthouse that rarely saw cases of such gravity. Lawyers were appointed for both the prosecution and the defense, although everyone knew that Rosie's full confession made the verdict virtually certain. The question would not be guilt or innocence, but rather the appropriate sentence. In the days leading up to the trial, Daniel visited Rosie in jail. He wasn't exactly sure why he felt the need to, perhaps seeking some understanding that remained elusive. They sat apart by bars, the dim afternoon light streaming through the small, high window of the cell. Rosie asked about the community, showing genuine curiosity about how people were reacting. Daniel answered honestly, describing a mixture of shock, sadness, and attempts at understanding. Rosie then asked a question that caught him off guard. She asked if he thought she was evil. Daniel remained silent for a long time, pondering his answer. Finally, he said that he didn't believe in absolute evil, but rather in choices that led people down increasingly dark paths. He said that she possessed knowledge and skill that could have served humanity, but that bitterness and isolation had led her to pervert those gifts into something terrible. Rosie listened expressionlessly, then nodded slowly, as if agreeing with the assessment. The conversation shifted to Rosie's past, to the years she spent learning medicine in unconventional ways. She spoke nostalgically of that time, when she believed she was contributing to something greater. The sadness in her voice was palpable, as she described how everything had crumbled, how she had been expelled from the only world she knew. She didn't offer this as an excuse, but simply as context. Daniel listened, recognizing the complex humanity, even in someone who had committed such inhumane acts. When Daniel finally left prison, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows across the streets of the small town. He felt strangely melancholic, carrying the weight of knowledge he wasn't sure how to process. Rosie Hale was simultaneously victim and perpetrator, someone whose potential had been wasted by circumstances and her own choices. There were no simple answers, only the complicated reality of human nature in its most disturbing manifestation. The trial was approaching, promising to bring some kind of formal closure to the case, but Daniel knew that the true process of understanding and healing would take much longer. For the community, for the families of the victims who could be identified, and for everyone who had been touched by that dark story in the Kentucky mountains, winter was coming, bringing snow that would blanket the trails and make the mountains even more isolated. But even under the white blanket of winter, the secrets revealed would remain in the collective memory, permanent reminders that even in the most beautiful places, deep shadows can lurk. Winter arrived in the mountains, bringing with it the characteristic silence of the snow that muffles all sounds. The trails were impassable for weeks, and the small community returned to its natural rhythm of seasonal isolation. Daniel decided to stay until spring, accepting occasional work and lodging at Eleanor Price's boarding house, which had become almost a second home to him. The events of that autumn fundamentally changed something in that region. People began to communicate more, to check on each other more frequently. The isolation that was once accepted without question was now viewed differently. Not that privacy ceased to be respected, but there was a renewed awareness that community meant more than simply living close to one another. Rosie's property remained abandoned, sealed off by the authorities while the legal proceedings ran their course. No one dared approach, and over time vegetation began to reclaim the space. The trees seemed to lean over the cabin as if nature were trying to hide that place from view, to slowly erase it from the landscape. Daniel spent many nights reflecting on everything he had witnessed. He thought about the choices that shape destinies, how talents can be directed towards light or darkness, depending on circumstances and personal decisions. He also thought about the fragility of human existence, how lives can be cut short by crossing the wrong path at the wrong time. Martha Coleman organized monthly gatherings at the church, meetings where people simply talked, shared stories, and maintained vibrant connections. They weren't necessarily formal or religious meetings, just moments of fellowship that reminded everyone they weren't alone in those vast mountains. Loneliness, they realized, could be dangerous not only for those who chose it, but for everyone around them. With the arrival of spring, Daniel finally prepared to leave. His time there had come to a natural end, and there were other places, other stories waiting. On the morning of his departure, several residents came to say goodbye, something that wouldn't have happened months before when they were still wary strangers. Thomas Brennan offered provisions for the journey, Samuel Pritchard drew a detailed map of the best routes, and Eleanor Price simply embraced him with tears in her eyes. As he rode down the trail, Daniel looked back one last time. The mountains rose majestically against the blue spring sky, their slopes covered in varying shades of green where new vegetation sprouted. It was a breathtakingly beautiful landscape, but he knew he would always carry the memory of what those shadows concealed. The stories that emerge from the depths of the mountains often carry a weight that words struggle to express. They are narratives that remind us of the complexity of human nature, of the fine line between light and shadow that exists in every choice. What happened in those isolated lands remains a reminder that even in the most remote places, where we think we are far from the judgment of the world, our actions carry consequences that eventually reach the light. Years would pass, and that community would move forward, stronger from the trials it had faced. The cabin would eventually crumble, reclaimed by the forest, becoming only a vague marker in the landscape. But the lessons would remain alive in the collective memory, passed down through generations as a warning about the dangers of absolute isolation and disconnection from shared humanity. And so, in the mountains of Kentucky, where the wind still whistles through the pines and the morning mist still rises from the valleys, the stories continue to be told, stories that remind us to watch out for one another, to keep connections alive, to never allow darkness to